As you will note from the policy statement, we have kept rates on hold, maintaining an accommodative stance while we await developments. We are within the inflation band given to us by the government and expect to be around 5% CPI inflation by March 2017, absent unforeseen eventualities. My hope is the next monetary policy statement will be by the proposed Monetary Policy Committee. The committee to select outside members of the MPC has commenced the process. On the RBI side, the board has selected Dr. Michael Patra to be the RBI board nominee on the MPC. The other two members from the RBI will, of course, be the governor and the deputy governor in charge of monetary policy. With the formation of the MPC, the government and the RBI will have completed a fundamental institutional reform which modernizes India's monetary policy framework and builds a platform for strong and sustainable growth. Some of the collateral benefits over and above low inflation will be a currency that is not depreciating constantly, higher real returns earned by savers, and lower nominal interest rates, including inflation risk premia paid by borrowers. A larger share of the policy statement than usual was devoted to a discussion of liquidity and how we see it going forward. As we have reiterated in the past, we do not see the FCNRB repayments as disruptive. With the preparation we have made and good management, redemptions should go smoothly. More generally, the new liquidity framework announced in the April policy is being implemented. We have reduced some of the structural liquidity deficit. However, the current surplus is partly because of seasonal factors and not because we have eliminated the structural deficit completely. To emphasize this point, we announced an open market purchase today. The RBI will proceed in a calibrated way towards the goal of eliminating the structural deficit. When we have done so, episodes of systemic surplus and systemic deficit should be evenly balanced. Now, despite easy liquidity, banks have passed rate cuts into lending rates only modestly. Earlier, some bankers said that it was the lack of liquidity that was holding rates high. Now, I hear from some that it's the fear of the FCNRB redemptions that is making them reluctant to cut rates. I have a suspicion that some new concern will crop up once the FCNRB redemptions are behind us. On our side, having examined our experience with the MCLR framework, we will shortly be suggesting some revisions. However, substantial pass-through will happen only as corporate credit demand picks up and as public sector banks, strengthened by clean balance sheets, compete for corporate business. In the next few weeks, we plan to announce guidelines for P2P lending and for account aggregators. On August 25th, we will unveil a new set of measures to improve the functioning of markets, especially the corporate bond markets. Some of these measures will build on the suggestions in the recent Khan Committee report. Before I end this statement, let me use this platform for two important messages that initiate the year-long public awareness and consumer protection campaign the RBI is going to embark on. First, one of the biggest sources of harassment for ordinary customers in the banking system is meeting KYC or Know Your Customer rules. Actually, these have been simplified considerably in the recent past, but sometimes your local branch may not know it. The applicable KYC rules can now be accessed from the RBI's web page by clicking on a bar entitled FAQs for KYC. It was put up this morning. For instance, if you move, your new address can be self-certified and you do not need proof of new address. If your branch does not know these simplified norms, please go to the RBI web page and point it out to them. You will be doing a public service. Second, if you get an email from me or any future governor promising to transfer a large sum of, say, rupees 50 lakhs to you, if only you send a small transaction fee of rupees 20,000 to a specific bank account, delete the email immediately. The reality is such emails are not from me and the RBI does not give out money directly to ordinary citizens, even though we print plenty of it. While the emails usually contain very convincing reasons why you've been chosen to receive the money, ask yourself why I simply cannot deduct rupees 20,000 and send you 49.8 lakhs. If you think for a moment, you should not fall prey to such emails. This is my last policy statement, but there are still 28 days in my term, which I intend to use fully. We will now take questions.
Lata.
Morning, Governor. Lata Venkatesh from CNBC TV 18. The very prominent word is adequate provision of liquidity and move towards system neutrality. Can you give us some calculation of what is the system deficit? Is it 2 lakh crore of base money that you have to create plus the old deficit of 90,000 crore? So is the deficit in your mind 3 lakh crore? Can you define that structural deficit? As well, are you comfortable with this 40,000 crore surplus? And even if it moves, it doesn't worry you that it might impact inflation or inflation expectations. A second question, you've been alarmingly silent about NPAs. Is it that you see it receding, or at least the pace of acceleration decelerating? Is there any confidence at all that that problem is getting resolved? Also, if you can give us some preview of what is this MCLR changes so that transmission happens.
3 questions, any more?
Yeah, if you want, may I? No. 3 more, sir.
On the question, now I forget the questions. The first
liquidity deficit.
First question was liquidity deficit. It's actually a more complicated calculation than you might think, because we have to also take into account what component of our dividend payment to the government, for example, is based on sort of income we've generated domestically versus income we've generated internationally. That also factors into the permanent liquidity calculation. I mean, broadly speaking, we were at a deficit of about 1% of NDTL, and we are moving to eliminate that over time. And the answer is we're probably about 40% of the way at this point. Now, there are seasonalities. Remember, June, July is when cash comes back from the system. And as a result, there tends to be excess liquidity at points like this. And the government also has spent quite a bit. Tax revenues haven't come back. So the point is not to have, to look at this as balance, because this will dissipate over time as tax collections come in. The point is to have neutrality over the entire year. Dr. Patel, would you like to add something on that?
Actually, when it was announced in April that we would eliminate the structural deficit, we had not given a timeline. And the reason for that are the factors that the governor mentioned, that there are a fair number of transitory issues also taking place. And in the back of our mind, it was a 1 to 2 year program. And I think we need that flexibility for the variety of reasons that you mentioned. And also for the fact that we have to make it congruent with the stance of monetary policy. It's not an unconstrained decision that was taken, but the path is well set that we want to eliminate that deficit, and we will calibrate it in the least disruptive and most beneficial manner.
The second question you had was on NPAs, and I'll ask Mr. Mundra to add anything on this. Broadly speaking, we are comfortable with the recognition process that banks have certainly taken a lot of steps. Some banks, as I've said publicly before, have taken more steps than we required them to take. And so the culture of cleaning up seems to be well embedded, as well as a culture of recovery on some of the loans. What remains is for some of these large stress projects to figure out a way to restructure them in a way that makes sense for the longer term health of the system and the health of the project. Now, there are a number of schemes, RBI schemes, that are available, the latest being the S4A. And well, early days. I think what is important is to make sure, see, the attitude towards these schemes is also changing. The earlier attitude was this is a way to postpone recognition. That is no longer there. Now the question is this a way to effect resolution? And so, the schemes are now being looked at with new eyes. And the hope is that as the recovery in the economy also starts taking place, some of the stressed assets will be put back on track. There'll also be more buying interest in some of the other assets which have the possibility of new ownership. So at this point, I think banks have enough tools. The real issue is to use them. And I think we're working with them to make sure that any...
Is the line disconnected?
At least let's put the volume down. Any impediments are rectified, but again and again we emphasize we don't want to go back to the old days of forbearance. So they have to use this in an effective way, and the schemes have been structured such that there is no implication of forbearance. Mundra Sahab, would you like to add something?
The only thing I would like to add here,
Conference is now being recorded.
Okay. Yeah. See, originally under the AQR program, we had given the roadmap which runs up to March 2017. And I think we had indicated several times that is a very clearly laid out path, and there won't be a need to have a relook at it again and again. As Governor mentioned, banks have moved on that path as it was laid out. Some of them have preferred to take an early call and probably took some major percentage of it in December and March quarter. Having said that, sometime we get the question because ratios are picked up in isolation. Sometime we talk about the stressed assets as a total, and sometime we pick up GNPA as a percentage and say there is an elevation and it is not what was indicated. I think what is important to look at it that during these 2 quarters and the June quarters where the results have come, there is a substantial migration between the categories. So maybe some of the assets which were earlier indicated in the overall stressed asset bucket might have moved from restructuring to GNPA percentage, but it was something which was very well, anticipated. Overall, if you look at it, the overall percentage of stressed assets, there is no significant elevation. The pace of generation of new NPA, there is a clear deceleration. And so I think that is what would be the roadmap. Of course, the provisioning requirement would continue to enhance as in remaining 3 quarters, some more assets do come within the bracket, and also the aging takes effect. As far as the various measures Governor has already mentioned. And I think the overall movement of the banks in that direction is getting more sure-footed, if not that any definite resolution is on the card, but I think the clarity is much greater than what it was when we embarked on this path.
Fourth question, Lata, please.
It's underway. You'll hear shortly.
Okay.
Review has been done. We're now working on what measures.
Yeah. One question per person, please. Anurag.
Sir, this is Anurag from Z Business, sir. Sir, जिस तरह से आपने कहा कि खाने पीने की महंगाई काफ़ी ज़्यादा थी जुलाई में, इस वजह से रेट कट पॉसिबल नहीं हो पाया और आगे अच्छी संकेत दिख रहे हैं, लेकिन सर क्या माने जो भी रेट कट होगा वो FY17 में ही हो सकता है, क्योंकि FY18 में तो जीएसटी लागू हो जाएगा, जीएसटी लागू होने के बाद हमेशा महंगाई बढ़ती है, तो जो भी रेट कट की संभावना है वो अगले 6-8 महीने में ही है। और सर एक चीज़ और आपसे समझना चाहूँगा, अभी आपने कहा कि 150 बेसिस पॉइंट जो आपने रेट कट किया उसका इतना पास ऑन नहीं हुआ, तो सर आप कहेंगे आप खुश नहीं या संतुष्ट नहीं है उस पास ऑन की वजह से?
Okay, 2 questions. On the first question on whether there is a time before which it will become impossible to do rate cuts, I don't really think one can argue in such a way that there is future inflation anticipated, therefore it will become impossible to do a rate cut. your rate cut is done taking into account the time path of inflation. If you think there's going to be more inflation in the future, you won't cut rates now. That said, I don't think it is wise to assume that GST implementation will necessarily increase inflation. And second, that whatever inflation that happens, whether it will be long-term or short-term, is something to think about. That it is quite possible it could be a one-time adjustment of prices, even if there is inflation. And similarly, with if some of the conditions of the pay commission, the allowances, for example, housing allowance, that also will be something that's passed through into prices over time, but it may be a one-time effect on inflation rather than a permanent effect. What, as monetary policy, the monetary policy setters have to be aware of is whether this feeds into more generalized inflation. And that is what they have to worry about. That is something the RBI will be worrying about going forward. On the second question was, I'm sorry, transmission. Yes, I mean, look, we would be happier if there was more transmission. I do understand some of the difficulties the banks have. And my sense is that as this process of cleanup happens, and as the economy recovers and credit demand also picks up, you will see more possibility of transmission.
Supriya, one question, please.
This is 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much. Sir, I wanted to follow up on this inflation bit. You sound worried about inflation. You are flagging off concerns, but somehow your policy doesn't talk about the GST inflation impact at all, even though you're talking about the 7th pay panel and you're talking about household expectations rising in turn. So that's question number 1. I will just follow up on NPAs for a bit because you've given a long answer and Mr. Mundra did exemplify that further, but are you satisfied with what's done, and do you worry there could be some amount of backtracking after you're gone? You've decided to kill the cruel joy that you spoke about in the last policy, but I'm just taking a liberty to ask you the second question.
Okay. Now I forget the first question. GST, look, it's premature to talk about the inflationary impact of GST when we don't know what the rates will be. As the rates are set, one can get a better estimate. And as I said, you know, the experience of other countries, for example, Malaysia, has been that the inflationary impact, in their case, there was an inflationary impact, but it was short-lived. What is important is we have to see that the price adjustment, if there is one, conditional on GST coming in, doesn't become generalized inflation. A lot depends on which prices go up, which prices come down. Some prices may also come down. And are these salient prices, not so salient prices? So I think it's premature at this point. The RBI currently is focused on meeting the glide path target of 5% by March 2017. We don't visualize GST obviously coming in before April 2017 at the earliest. And therefore, this is outside, in a sense, the short-term horizon for which we are planning, but it has to factor into the medium-term horizon. That said, before we know the numbers, it is premature to talk about it. Let me just ask Urjit to add to that first answer, and then I'll talk about that.
You know, about 55% of the CPI basket will not be impacted by the GST. Secondly, as the governor said, the effective rate is going to be important. But remember that one benefit of the GST is that the cascading disappears. So you might actually get effective tax rates on many goods and services to come down. And usually as the base expands, you don't need to have a tax rate which is as high as would be required. So the inflationary impact, firstly, it could just be one time. Secondly, to the extent that such a large part of the CPI basket is already out of it, I think the durable impact on it is likely to be limited. But it remains to be seen, and the full effects of this will be only felt, if at all, possibly in the second half of the next financial year as we go forward.
On the NPAs, first let me introduce to you our new Deputy Governor in charge of regulation, Mr. Viswanathan. So as you can see, Mr. Viswanathan will be essentially holding the fort on that issue along with Mr. Mundra. And I don't see why that should be assumed that there would be any backtracking. I think the path is clear. There has been substantial cooperation all along the way between the government and the RBI on this. The banks know what needs to be done. The promoters know what needs to be done. And therefore, I would think that it's a process of doing it as opposed to backtracking.
No, I would just like to add that a policy becomes very successful when those who are impacted by the policy also start firmly believing it and start practicing it on their own. And as both of us mentioned, that banks themselves have now quite proactively engaged with this. So I think it will be a virtuous cycle which should continue.
Shishir.
गवर्नर राजन नमस्कार, मेरा नाम शिशिर है, मैं एबीपी न्यूज़ से हूँ। दो सवाल के परंपरा को आगे बढ़ाता हूँ मैं। मेरा
नहीं, you guys don't follow my instruction. I like to instruct the governor.
क्योंकि आपने कहा कि जीएसटी लागू करना टाइम के हिसाब से जो टाइम दिया गया है उसके हिसाब से बहुत चैलेंजिंग है, तो सबसे बड़ा चैलेंज आपके हिसाब से क्या है अगर 1 अप्रैल 2017 से लागू करना है? और दूसरा सवाल कि तमाम आंकड़े आ रहे हैं कि जीएसटी लागू होने के बाद जीडीपी 1%, 1.5%, 2% बढ़ सकता है, आपका असेसमेंट क्या है?
So first on the challenges, obviously this is an enormous undertaking, and such an enormous undertaking will require efficient implementation from all sides. Also, there are, as you know, some legislative sort of requirements. The states have to pass it, at least half the states, and so that will take some time. But broadly speaking, the government is confident of doing it. I don't see any reason to doubt it, but it is a challenging task. On the issue of how much this will add to GDP, I think this is more guesswork than I think other countries that have managed to do this have seen, as Dr. Patel said, both an improvement in revenues, but also by unifying the market in the country, you both reduce the transaction costs of transport, which is very important, the time, the wastage, etc. But you also increase efficiency because now you can produce anywhere for anywhere. You don't have to locate because you want to produce for that particular territory or whatever. So those kinds of benefits of a unified market may be harder to calculate but may be significant in the longer run. So 2% is not a big number. I would think that should be achievable. Let us see.
Viren.
सर वीरेंद्र सिंह गुनावत फ्रॉम इंडिया टुडे आज तक। सर सिंपल सवाल करना चाहूँगा कि आपका सफ़र काफ़ी कंट्रोवर्शियल रहा है। एक सिंपल सवाल करना चाहूँगा कि काफ़ी पॉलिटिकल आरोप प्रत्यारोप चले हैं, कुछ इमोशंस आपकी फैमिली की तरफ से भी आए हैं, काफ़ी स्टेटमेंट्स भी आए हैं, आपके फादर ने भी काफ़ी इंटरव्यूज़ में कहे हैं कुछ बातें।
Let me stop you there. My father was surprised by one reporter, and I don't think the reporter should be going after families. They should have stayed away. They got in. He gave an answer. I don't have anything more to say on that.
कोई बात नहीं सर। सवाल से बहुत ही सिंपल सा कि एक कंक्लूजन जानना चाहेंगे क्योंकि हो सकता है कि हमें बाद में मौका ना मिले सवाल करने का। कैसा रहा सफ़र ये आपका? कुछ कहना चाहेंगे उन लोगों के लिए जो आप पे उंगली उठाए थे?
Look, I have nothing to say. Critics are there all the time. There are also people who send me messages in the plane from the back, anonymous notes saying, thank you for what you're doing. So you get both sides. That's part of the job. You have to take it as the costs and the benefits. And I think the most important thing is that at the end of the day, you feel you've made a useful contribution and that, some people are better off as a result of it. I think from that perspective, this has been a fantastic job. And when I said sometime back when somebody asked me, how has it been? I've enjoyed every minute of it, partly because every day when my sort of fellow colleagues at the RBI and I sit together and work, we manage to move the needle forward a little bit at the end of the day. You leave the office saying, we did something. And there are very few places where you can have that sense of satisfaction. So I think this has been a fantastic experience, and I hope there's some value added.
Govardhan?
So Govardhan from the Economic Times. Now that the government has agreed to the inflation targeting, so there are two sentences that you added to the last policy. Is that food prices pushed up the projected inflationary trajectory, and at the same time the risks have tilted to the upside. But you have maintained the inflation forecast at 5%. Is there something uncomfortable that is being left out of the document despite all these risks being flagged off?
No. So we have flagged some risks, but there is, remember, these risks relating to food could be reversed by what we are already seeing as a reasonably good monsoon and the sowing patterns. Now, where we have been a little hesitant is because in the past monsoons, good sowing patterns have been reversed over time because the monsoon has faltered. So until we see the full effects of the monsoon, it would be premature to declare victory, but I think the meteorological department has told us to expect more of the same. Given that, we have some confidence that some of the elements that went up in price, certainly the seasonality in vegetables, but also potentially pulses because of the large sowing in pulses, that some of those prices should come down and should give us the negative impact on inflation, which will offset some of these upside risks that we've talked about. So broadly, we're comfortable that we should be reaching 5%. Of course, there are uncertainties which could emerge.
And you also mentioned about the negative yields in some of the developing economies, sovereign rate. So does that mean that you see a kind of a bond bubble burst?
No, I think those who initially saw the negative yields and were worried about an immediate crash in bond prices were surprised by the fact that the yields went even more negative, and now more yields are trading negative. Is this a healthy and long-term state for the global economy? Probably not. Is it going to collapse tomorrow? Probably not.
Shobna?
Shobna from Financial Express. On the FCNRB, you said you didn't have too much concern. So are you expecting redemptions of the levered and the unlevered positions? Because sometime back there was concern that the banks may not have enough Forex to be able to deliver to RBI and then redeem the deposits.
See, let's separate two things. One is the 26 billion which has come in FCNRB. Now that includes, borrowed, people have borrowed money and then invested in FCNRB. That total is 26 billion. Now let's assume all of it goes out, right? We have not only covered it in forward markets, we have covered about 90% of it in forward, 80% of it in forward markets. And we have 365 billion as of last count in reserves. So even if it all goes out, we can completely, pay for it, right? So the real question is whether there would be short-term disruptions in the market, because, for example, some of the banks who have sold us forward contracts find that they're not able to realize dollars from elsewhere. We will be monitoring the markets. We don't want to give a blanket guarantee that there will be no volatility. We want banks to be prepared to deliver to us. But if there is volatility, we will do what is necessary.
Pradeep?
सर, आपने जो आम लोगों के लिए दो बातें कही, उस पर आपसे ये जानना चाहेंगे कि आप अवेयरनेस बढ़ाने की बात कर रहे हैं और हम लोग भी अपने चैनल पे अवेयरनेस बढ़ाते रहते हैं, लेकिन एज अ रेगुलेटर जो आपने KYC रूल्स की बात कही, अगर किसी ग्राहक को कोई शिकायत है और आपके रूल्स बताने के बाद भी उसका काम नहीं होता, तो क्या शिकायत करने का, रिड्रेसल का कोई मैकेनिज्म है? और सेम जो आपने फ्रॉडुलेंट ईमेल्स की बात कही, फ़ोन कॉल्स भी आते हैं लोगों को, क्या उसकी शिकायत का कोई मैकेनिज्म आप बना रहे हैं जो RBI के ज़रिए उनको एक रास्ता मिले या कोई कदम उठाए जाएं या कोई एक्शन लिया जाए? और दूसरा एक सवाल मेरा इन्फ्लेशन टारगेटिंग पे था कि आप जब आए थे तो सरकार ने आपसे बातचीत करके इन्फ्लेशन टारगेट तय किया था. इस बार गवर्नर और MPC का अपॉइंटमेंट का प्रोसेस चल रहा है, उसके पहले ही एक टारगेट आ गया है, क्या आपके साथ कोई बातचीत हुई, आपके कंसेंसस से ये टारगेट तय हुआ?
To address that, okay. On the KYC norms, I mean, usually if you have a complaint about banks, you first take it up with the bank. You ask the bank, here's a particular problem I have, and banks will deal with it. If you cannot get redress from the banks, you can use our ombudsman system. So that is the second layer. After you first take it up with the banks and give them an opportunity to redress. You can do that on our website. There is a way to file a complaint with the ombudsperson via email, via the website. The second aspect is fraudulent, fraud, theft, ATM fraud, phone fraud. Those we now have a special website which will send your complaint directly to the state level coordination committee, which includes some of the law enforcement agencies. And if you have such complaint, we will give you immediately a registered number for your complaint, and you can track how that complaint is being addressed by the various agencies. Mundra sir, would you like to add on that? So that in fact was inaugurated last week, that particular website and the complaint. On the
regarding the 4% plus and minus 2 target, there are three processes. One, the RBI's expert committee to revise and strengthen the monetary policy framework itself had recommended 4% plus or minus 2, and the recommendations were based on a fair bit of analysis. Secondly, the monetary policy framework agreement, which the governor signed on behalf of the RBI with the government in February of 2015, that also had 4 plus or minus 2%. And subsequent to the amendment of the RBI Act, there have been discussions with the government from the RBI side, and what has been endorsed is the 4% plus or minus 2. And that process is regardless of the monetary policy committee. The target has to be established between the bank and the government.
Thank you. Sajid?
Governor Sajid here from Bloomberg Quint. Two questions. The first one, the policy talks about you're awaiting space for policy rate action. What are the factors that you look at which will create space for a policy rate action? And the second one on the inflation, you have maintained the 5% target for March 2017. What are the risks to breaching of that 5% target which you have? And given the fact that the impact of CPC or the 7th Pay Commission hasn't been factored in, has any exercise been done? What kind of impact it may have on the inflation if it continues?
We have done exercises on what the impact of the 7th Pay Commission allowances would be, and it depends to some extent on what the final announcement is and the pace at which it will be rolled out, the pace at which it will be rolled out by the states, etc. So there is some mechanical increase in housing inflation when it is rolled out. And we have to figure out how to adjust for that. As I said, typically mechanical increases, one-time increases, it is possible to look through some of that and say, okay, this is going to happen for one time, but it'll come back after that, after we've been through this particular phase. What is more difficult is to gauge how this will impact generalized inflation. If people see that inflation is higher through the CPI index, though they don't see daily prices going up, how will they adjust, and will it then impact inflation more generally? So these are things that the RBI will have to consider. It would be premature to say exactly what it will do. Going forward, of course, the impact of the good monsoon, especially on food prices, will be helpful, as will the fact that, to some extent, energy prices have thus far remained still modest and moderate. Let us see going forward. I think a stronger impact of the monsoon on food prices, as well as the continuing disinflation in services inflation, for example, those would create more policy space. It is something that we have to watch for. There has been only 1 month in which services inflation, which had sort of settled, was sticky around 5, has shown some life below that, but we have to see. I think we are data dependent. Let's see.
Manojit?
Manojit Shah from The Hindu. So there will be some amount of expectation, pressure on your successor to cut rates quickly and sharply. So what will your advice, suggestion to your successor in your battle against inflation?
So I don't advise my successor. Moreover, I think there is some likelihood that the next decision will be made by a monetary policy committee rather than an individual. If that is the case, there will be 6 people sitting together and deciding what the path of interest rates will be. I think we should expect them to take an independent decision, and I'm sure they will.
Why you are so hopeful that next decision will be taken by a monetary policy committee?
I mean, everything is in place except the selection of the 3 members that the government has to decide on. And as I said, that process has already started. So it's not going to take a long time to do that.
Thank you.
We'll go out and check if there are questions outside. Margaret, can you check, please?
Sure, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please press star and 1 if you wish to ask a question. This is for the participants connected at the audio bridge. If you wish to ask a question, please press star and 1. The first question is from the line of Manju from DNA newspaper. Please go ahead.
Good morning, Governor. Since you're concerned about common man's causes, I just have this question to ask. Banks do not reduce bank loan rates, home loan rates, even if they bring down the base rate, unless customers write to them. And the floating home loan rates of banks only tend to go up. They don't move down. So will the RBI look at the arbitrary movement of retail home loan rates? Because you said that you will be utilizing your 28 days remaining fully, so I thought whether you could do something about this. Another thing I wanted to ask you, my second question, in your letter to the employees, you said that you will be available to serve India whenever needed, and later on in Bangalore you said that you are still around and probably a lot in India. So just wanted to know, would you be in some capacity in the country? What would you do besides being in Chicago University?
Okay, let me ask Mr. Mundra to respond to your first question. I can respond to the second question. Look, I just go back to my previous sort of employment structure, where I used to both work at the University of Chicago, but also have a considerable involvement in different Indian causes. Earlier, for example, I was involved with the Indian School of Business, and we'll see going forward what I do, but I haven't made plans yet.
No, I think there is already an admission that interest was more for the second question, but nonetheless, let me see on the housing loan. If it is taken as a floating rate, there are choice available to the customer, taken as a floating rate or fixed rate. If it is taken on fixed rate, then of course a different thing. But if it is a floating rate, and if there is a movement either in MCL or base rate, then I don't see a situation where that after reducing the MCLR, the benefit would not be passed on to the customer. If there are any specific instances, we can certainly look into it.
It's never passed on until the customer writes to the bank. Most of the floating home loan rates are at over 11% now, if you check out.
No, see, what is the floating rate is something which is a contract which was entered into. If there is a certain spread over the, though my sense is that most of the banking industry and housing loan is around base rate. But if there is a specific instance, we can look into it. But what I was trying to say, there are, as Governor mentioned, the MCLR framework itself, we are having a relook. In this year's supervisory cycle, we also would be putting emphasis on the calculation and implementation of MCLR in the individual banks. That is also on the agenda. And beyond that, if there are specific instances, I think it will be very difficult to react to a general remark because it may be one isolated incident. But in the large part of banking industry, if I understand, the position is that a floating rate loan with the change in the benchmark rate gets automatically passed on. But we'll be very happy if there is a specific incident which can be brought to our notice. See, again, I mean to say, if the original contract carries a particular clause and it is governed by that, but as far as the retail loan and housing loan are concerned, I think it has been now more than 2 or 3 years that the prepayment charges have been abolished. There can't be any prepayment charges. Reset charges will be a matter of some. See, we will not be completely kind of entering into the commercial agreements and commercial judgments of the bank. Anything which is normal in usual course of business and which does not look unreasonable, I don't think that we would be really interfering into that. But if there is something which patently on the face of it looks unreasonable or looks onerous, then certainly we will have a role there.
So we'll take it back, and one last question from this room. Vijay.
So a lot of the criticism that has come, so Vijay from Cogensis, sorry. A lot of the criticism that has come to your tenure has been about your inflation focus. Do you think that the fact that the government has agreed to a 4% target, a 2 to 6% band, the fact that there's the MPC that's already in place, the NPAs are going down, do you think it validates all the work that you mentioned when you came in and you've been able to achieve during this tenure?
Look, I think snap judgments, either by critics or by supporters, aren't really what matters. I think what matters is how this plays out in the longer run for stronger and sustainable growth for the country, for job creation, for our movement into the middle income. I think that's something that you can see only with the benefit of 5-6 years of experience and to know whether in fact it was appropriate. In our view, the measures we have taken in the RBI were and are justified given the conditions that we have. People can have different judgments, but we have to see, as Mundra Sahab often says, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Let's see over the next 5-6 years how this plays out, and then we'll reach a judgment whether this was good or bad.
So that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.